I just started recording. So I've been reading the texts in terms of that you've sent about rebirth and about past lives. I was also reading Bhikkhu Nanananda in terms of consciousness and the fact that consciousness and name and form are intertwined, with consciousness being the one that helps to grow name and form. And there was a notion that body travels in a completely different way than mind, in the sense that from a body, I'm going from here to there, and a mind, it's a viewpoint. It's just a viewpoint in terms of where consciousness arises, name and form. And then there was this notion that in terms of a being passing away, and consciousness at that point in time just spontaneously arises in the next being, which may be a human birth. And the notion that there's like this rebirth consciousness, Bhikkhu Nanananda said, actually, that's not really true. It's just a new consciousness arising. And so that's, in my mind, this concept of like spontaneous rebirth.
Yeah.
Sorry for the long introduction before the questions. Now, in my mind, and I'm thinking, okay, so there's all kinds of formations that are happening, and there's this last intention that's basically driving this. And then the next rebirth, if we just assume right now it's a human rebirth,
yeah,
will have the result of the existing old karma in one's existing human life that can come to fruition in a next birth. But then my key question is, how can that happen in terms of quote unquote selection of this next mother's run that I have no clue about? Because the moment of conception contains all the elements for the human birth. It's like the cause for all of the future name and form and consciousness to happen. But then again, that means that my passing away needs to coincide with a conception on the other side.
Yeah.
And then I'm just trying to link the two, and I'm thinking, okay, then it's actually pretty natural that the thought arises that should be some overarching consciousness, or there should be some deva realm that's helping out with selecting the right, the right place for rebirth. I don't know if the question makes sense, but I'm just thinking, how does that work?
Yeah. So let's make sure we clarify this point first, that there is spontaneous rebirth. According to the suttas, according to the understanding of the suttas and the Nikayas, from the, let's say, Theravada perspective specifically, there is no sort of purgatory, let's say, some sort of space in between one life and then like a waiting room and then another life. It's spontaneous. So spontaneous rebirth can happen in the Deva realms, but here spontaneous rebirth would mean conception in the human realm. So to simplify, as you said, we will limit our parameters to understanding the rebirth from one human life to the next human life. So in terms of the rebirth consciousness, as we're talking about, if you go back to Majjhima Nikaya 106, there the Buddha refers to something known as Patisandhi, if I'm not mistaken. Patisandhi is translated in Bhikkhu Bodhi's version as evolving, so the evolving consciousness, which means the consciousness that is activated by the last set of formations that the the mind inclines towards with craving and attachment, or with some kind of emotional aversion towards it. And this can come in the form of regret, remorse for things that one has already done. It can come in the form of uh, having craving for what one sees. It can come in a karmic sign of seeing deva beings or seeing angelic beings, as they say, which means that it's a sign of destiny of where the next destination could possibly be if the mind starts to go towards that. Like sometimes you'll see a white light and the mind will go towards that, or whatever it might be. The whole point here is in going towards something is where the cause of rebirth is, especially if there is craving and identification present in that process. That then activates the last consciousness, which then it's like a carrier. In the same way the formations are carriers for karma, the consciousness is the carriers for those formations to then go and take root in that conception. So that's why we have the rarity of the human birth, because when you mention conception, there can be a man and a woman in sexual activity, but there might not be conception there present. So conception is in itself very rare, and it's dependent upon obviously matching with the karmic, let's say, frequency, for lack of a better word, meaning the formations somehow gelled well with the conceiving act, which happens when the sperm meets the egg, the ovum. And when that happens, this is where, when we were referring to the text about what happens to formations, if we liken it to synapses in the brain, let's say, from a neuroscientific perspective, what about before then? What about before that, where it's the conception? There's no brain developed there. There's no mind necessarily developed there, but it's just the meeting, the union of mother and father, and then it's this development of the embryo and the fetus and so on. But before all of that, what you have to see is there's the genetic material. Half of that genetic material, so to speak, is from the ovum, and half of that is from the sperm. When the sperm meets with the ovum and there is conception, then these two genetic materials are also karmic factors that then are matched with the karmic impressions from those formations, which means that genes or genetic expression is the beginning of how formations take root in a life form. So certain kinds of genes activate certain kinds of uh, patterns of behavior as well. So the environment can have an effect on the genes, and vice versa, dependent upon the 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 continual strength of that gene expression. So in that sense, again, that doesn't mean that a disease is an effect of some karmic cause necessarily from some past life. It will not always be the case, because as the Buddha has already said in one of the suttas, that there are other elements to take into account. There is the body itself, in terms of its humors, as they call it, in terms of the different elements present. It's dependent upon climate and other factors. So it's not just the karma from the formations, but it has to match with the genetic expression of that body. So there could be a potential for that body, for example, to develop a certain disease, but it might not. It just might not, because of the habits that one imbibes in their body. And because of that, it might not bring to expression that gene that can cause that underlying disease to arise and become predominant in the body. So when it comes to conception and when it comes to that process of death, it might seem like it's coincidental, like this happened, and so therefore there's some kind of consciousness now in the limbo where it's looking for, some place to get conceived. But that's why it's incalculable in terms of karma and rebirth in that sense. It might seem random, but it's not random. It's just because because of those certain formations that that mind has last attached to, those formations somehow find the right genes that are being formed and fused together in the process of conception. And so it links to those genes. And from there, that whole genetic expression starts to develop the embryo and so on and so forth. So those formations are rooted primarily and first and foremost in that new being within the genes. And then from there, that starts to produce the different aspects of mentality and materiality itself. Then, depending upon how the being after they are born starts to interact with the world and starts to see things, starts to activate certain synapses that become built up over time, dependent upon the genetic expression and dependent upon the environment that it's interacting.
Okay. So the concept that this helps to clarify a lot, but there's still one question then, the finding piece.
Yeah.
That's where for me the linkage is in terms of the arising consciousness and the formations. That makes sense. That's like this spontaneous flow in terms of formations and the synapses and the evolution. That piece, no questions. But the finding piece, that's where I'm a little bit struggling in my mind in terms of how does that work? Because it's basically, well, we limit it now to the human will, but basically it's across all of the wills, it's across everything.
Yeah. Okay, let's use a few real life examples, real world examples right now in this life. If you could recall the first time when you were in the first grade or in kindergarten, right? And you naturally made friends with certain kids when you were a child. Why did you make friends with those kids? What was the association there?
The situation arose, like we were together in the kindergarten. There was an inclination on recognition, which could be similar preferences, or which could be preferences based on one's attitudes, one's image, anything like that, basically.
Yes, yes. Now you start growing up and you start making certain friends in your workplace or start making friends in general in life. You see in your life, you start to, let's say, gravitate towards certain kinds of behaviors, certain kinds of personalities that seem to gel well with your worldview or seem to gel well with your perspective on life and so on and so forth. And some of these friendships can be lifelong just because there's some kind of undercurrent of these joining of similar personalities or preferences and so on. In the same way, when the formations arise or come out from that death, let's say, then they incline towards the two parents that are similar minded in terms of behavior, in terms of desires, in terms of personalities, in terms of mindsets, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't mean that the formations themselves have some kind of necessarily soul-like intelligence to identify, but it's like how you would have a lock and key. Here, the key is the formations, and the genetic signatures from the joining of conception is the lock, and the right key finds the right lock and unlocks it so that conception is possible. So it's as if, and it's not exactly like that, but it's as if those formations through that consciousness is able to identify like-minded, so to speak, or similar formations or similar material to bind to that can produce evolution of that growth of those formations and consciousness and so on. So that means the parent's personality as well has some kind of bearing into what kind of childhood that person will have, what kind of upbringing they will have. So it's like matching these two, and it happens spontaneously. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yeah, that makes sense. The example I was reading last night from Bhikkhu Nanananda was explaining it actually in a very similar way, that the formations and the consciousness is just like one flow basically, and there's no discontinuity in that flow. So yeah, yes, it makes sense. It makes sense.
You could use certain examples in the suttas as well. For example, the Buddha would say that at that time, there were some ascetics and wanderers who did certain practices, like, for example, behaving like certain animals. And what the Buddha would say is people who do that, or in that time, would be reborn like the animals that they're behaving in a different lifetime. Now, that's a very rudimentary example, but if you think about it, if there's a person in their life who is always very wholesome, who's very deva-like in that sense, they have a certain kind of confidence in the Dhamma, they have a certain kind of shining personality, so to speak, where people are just always finding them to be wonderful to hang around with, wonderful to be with, and so on. And so they start to, because of those formations, because of those behavioral patterns, because they have attained certain even jhanas, for example, they can go into the Brahma realms, or they can go into the sixth sensuous heavens, depending on whether they've been in a jhana or not. That's something else entirely. But just because that personality has been developed because of the strengthening of certain formations, that's why when they do pass on, their formations are elevated towards the Deva realms, elevated towards the sensual heavens, just because they're no longer necessarily human-like with the same kinds of unwholesome features and so on. And so because of the merit that they have produced in that one life, he gets attracted to the Deva realms, the formations and the consciousness. And so it is just spontaneous rebirth there. Like you just go to this one of the heavens or the heavenly realms with the Devas or the Brahmas, and you just spontaneously arise. There's no conception or anything. It's just there you are. So in the same way, when it comes to conception in the human realm, it's the same spontaneity possible there. And indeed, it is the case there all the time. It's just that it's so complex that you can't necessarily always calculate exactly where that person is going to be born unless you really dig deep into their formations. And for that, you would require, extrasensory sort of intelligence and wisdom to be able to notice that. And that usually belongs to a Buddha to be able to know, because of these certain formations and their karma, they then were elevated to a Deva realm, or they took place in a lower realm, or whatever it might be. So it is an entire flow. It's not like there's a break. So just to clarify the situations, there are these terms used like patisandhi to explain the linking consciousness or the evolving consciousness. or the rebirth thinking consciousness, or however you want to name it. But the consciousness is the same. It's the same way like how you divide consciousness dependent upon the experience of the senses. There's an eye consciousness, a ear consciousness, nose consciousness, so on. In the same way, there's a rebirth consciousness insofar as it sees, it drives forward the intentions to a certain birth, to a certain conception. So you can liken the conception to a sensory experience. So from there, it gets attracted to certain behaviors of the mother and the father that are joined together at that point of conception and take fruition in the form of this joining of genetic material, in which is contained the different behavioral patterns, the different genetic expressions for certain kinds of attitudes, certain kinds of mindsets, certain kinds of predispositions, both physically and mentally. And it just magnetizes towards it and just, joins like that. So it happens like a finger snap, even faster than a finger snap.
Thank you.